Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Eric Davis, continuing our conversations about the cultures of consciousness. I regularly get emails from listeners to the show, and that's always pleasant. I mean, usually they're not complaining, because if they were, they would probably just not bother writing. But it's good to get the positive feedback. It's kind of fuel for the hamster wheel, if you will. I enjoy doing the show, but if I was doing it into a void, I would stop. So knowing that people are listening and getting something out of it is really key to my happiness. And often when people write, they complain, however, that the shows are too brief, or at least with some of the guests. And I agree. As one of a stream of shows on the Progressive Radio Network, I'm allotted an hour slot, and I've been here since the beginning. And I kind of like the coziness of being part of a larger enterprise, even though it does restrict the time of the show to about 57 minutes. So unless I get my act together enough to start up a whole page where there's extra shows and goodies and things for people who want to pay more and blah, 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 we'll continue in this free radio modality and instead turn to the two-parter. And so today's show will be the first time that I'm doing a second part of an interview. Probably try to do this more in the future, at least some of the time. Today's guest is Eric Wargo, for those of you who weren't tuning in last week, who's the author of Time Loops, Precognition, Retrocausation, and the Unconscious. And part of the reason I wanted to talk to him for longer is that Eric's core argument, which is that there is precognition, and in some sense our brains are able to perceive signals from the future, not so much in some mystical, supernatural, prophetic way, but just because of the physics of space-time. That this idea, it rubs so harshly against our kind of natural, or at least modern, sense of time and the open-endedness of the future, the open-endedness of our decisions, that it's actually really a tough thing to wrestle with. So I thought it would be worth spending another hour talking to Eric about his very intriguing ideas, because the way in which he talks about his relationship to science, to humanities, to psychoanalysis, and just to writing and thinking in general is so rich that even if you are resistant to the core idea, which I admit I remain, it's a very worthwhile journey to take. All right. Well, welcome back, Eric. Welcome to Expanding Mind, part 2 of our conversation on time loops. And, I think I just want to start out with that idea of time loops, because by time loops, you're not just talking about precognition, about the presentiment of some future state or future learning experience that my brain will go through. You're talking about something a little weirder than that, and yet you show many examples of it, and it's such a intriguingly mysterious, enigmatic, and kind of thrilling idea. So what exactly do you mean by the time loop?
Yeah, what I mean is, first of all, as I say in the book, I don't mean that time itself, somehow the fabric of space-time is looping back on itself. That's not what I mean. I'm using the term time loops as kind of a convenient term for what we really call self-fulfilling prophecies. That is to say, you have, for instance, a precognitive dream, which your actions are somehow influenced by that dream, and those actions wind up leading to the situation that you precognized. Now, that on the surface, that sounds like, wait a minute, no, that's not, you're not playing fair somehow with logic and so forth. I mean, it's a tautology. If in the world of term papers and scientific arguments, that's a no. You don't you don't support your premise by your conclusions or vice versa. But in a world where information refluxes into the past, whether we're talking on a quantum level or on a human level, or both, self-fulfilling prophecies would have to be the norm. I mean, they would have to exist. And I think the big contribution I feel like I'm making in this book is to say, look, if precognition is real, and I provide lots of evidence why it's real, then we have to accept this notion of self-fulfilling prophecy, that not only ought to happen sometimes, but that it would maybe kind of be inevitable. And that more than that, maybe that's the real kind of secret hidden structure of our lives and our psychology. And it would make sense, a really parsimonious sense of a lot of kind of disparate kinds of experiences that kind of get put in separate bins because people haven't really connected them up that well. But it would make a sense of a lot of different, paranormal phenomena, for instance, and it could certainly unify, the field of ESP phenomena.
Can you give a concrete example you talk about in the book, or one that really helps when you're explaining this idea of the kind of how the self-fulfilling prophecy works?
Well, the best idea, I think, is the case of Carl Jung's patient, Maggie Quarles van Ufford. She is the patient that is at the center of the famous scarab story, which I'm sure all of your listeners probably have heard, a million times and read a million times, because it's probably the most, one of the most retold anecdotes in modern sort of New Age spiritual literature, and certainly in Jungian psychology. It's sort of Jung's specimen case of synchronicity, and that's the story where this young woman, who's very, very hyper rational and closed off to the mysteries and so forth. She's in his office, and she's telling him her dream that she had the night before, that someone gave her a piece of jewelry that was a golden scarab beetle. Just at that moment, while she's telling the story, he hears this tapping on the glass behind him, and he turns around, and at his window is a rose chafer beetle, which is the sort of Central European close relative of the Egyptian dung beetle. And he opens it. He has the presence of mind to open the window and let this beetle in and hand it to his patient and say, "Here's your scarab." Okay. And that becomes, this kind of story that around which he sort of constructs this theory of synchronicity. It's not just this one story, but I mean, that becomes his best example, his most famous example of the idea of synchronicity, which is this idea of archetypes in the collective unconscious, in this case, an ancient symbol of rebirth and metamorphosis, somehow manifesting in real life, including in sort of the material physical interaction of him and his patient who happened to need some kind of thing to burst her out of this hyper-rational way of thinking and whatever. And so he delivers this beetle to her, and it sort of opens her to the mysteries or whatever. Well, in one of the chapters in my book, I think it's kind of my favorite chapter of the book, actually, I basically reread this story. We happen to now know a lot about this patient. Just since, I think it was 2014, a Jungian analyst and one of the curators at the Jung Center in Zurich, named Vicente de Mora, published an article where he revealed the woman's identity and details of her biography, and also was able to sort of point to where else she appears in his writings. And this has enabled us to kind of reconstruct her case in a much broader way than just this one paragraph in his writings on synchronicity. Anyway, this woman named Maggie Quarles van Ufford, she was a Dutch aristocrat. I look at this as, I look at Jung's sort of theory as kind of he didn't intend to mystify things, but I think he sort of threw a monkey wrench in people's thinking about these possibilities of retrocausation and precognition by sort of wanting to collapse the time dimension. Synchronicity, the very word seems to imply a simultaneity, that time is somehow an illusion. Well, I argue that though it's not, it's maybe sort of an illusion, the way we usually think of time may be an illusion, but that we really need to think seriously about how events unfold in sequence, and also how events in the past may be influenced by things yet to come. And so what I show is that what's really happening in this episode is that a woman has a very standard precognitive dream. I mean, the very typical kind of precognitive dream, a slightly symbolic, slightly distorted version of an event that's a very significant event that's going to happen in her life in the very next day, which is that her doctor, this doctor that she's has this transference relationship with, she's sort of in love with in the sort of psychoanalytic sense, hands her a scarab beetle and then proceeds to deliver this wonderful explanation of her life in terms of these archetypes of the collective unconscious. And it's like, a very exciting therapeutic moment for her. Well, she just has a precognitive dream about it the night before. But that temporal dimension is sort of obscured by Jung's sort of synchronicity explanation. And but the key of this, the reason what makes it a time loop, is that it was her own telling of the dream that led him to notice the beetle at his window and open the window, let the beetle in. So there's this causal circularity there. And that causal circularity makes it very hard to talk about these events. I mean, it's very, our language is just not set up to talk about events in the future causing events in the past. And then when you have a loop like that, where do you even begin? So it's kind of, you wind up in these circles when you're writing about it. It was a challenge to write about these kinds of events. But when you start studying this field of parapsychology, when you start studying precognition and synchronicities and prophetic fiction writings and so forth, you wind up again and again with these kind of loop structures where it was somehow the telling of the dream or the writing of the story that precipitated the experience that wound up somehow refluxing in time to provide the dream or the inspiration that led to the story. So it's like you wind up with these causally circular structures. Again, the self-fulfilling prophecy, we usually use that term kind of figuratively, but here I mean it very, very literally.
Well, and I think one thing that distinction that you make in the book that's really important is you distinguish that kind of time loop from one of the classic problems in science fiction time travel stories, which you call or other people have called the grandfather paradox, like where somehow if you could travel through time, you could go back and kill your grandfather. Well, then how could you be there to kill your grandfather? Da, 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 da. So you get into those kind of like alternative universes that shift depending on the backflow of, in this case, you, not just information. And you'd want to make a big distinction between those kinds of paradoxes and the tautology that you're describing here in terms of the time loop or the self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think it might help to clarify that distinction, because as soon as you start talking about time loops, we start automatically going and digging through our science fiction repertoire and finding stories of these kinds of returns. But that's I think it's for you, it's important to not go down that corridor and to maintain that distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. Tautologies are not the same thing as paradoxes. In fact, they're kind of the opposite. The reason I think people conflate them, they tend to naturally conflate them because they sort of fall together in your teachers or your professors at one point or another, when telling you about faults of logic, would probably lump them sort of in the same category of sort of same bestiary of bad things to avoid when thinking, But a paradox is very different. It's an impossibility, whereas a tautology is kind of a hyper possibility. There's nothing in, and certainly there's nothing in physical law that prevents self-fulfilling prophecies. In fact, there's a whole kind of subdomain of physics and cosmology that kind of has addressed this question. What's called in physics, it's called a closed time-like curve, and that is again a causal loop structure. There's mathematics and physics to show, this is just fine. This there's no reason this can't happen. And by the same token, the same mathematics and physics shows that you can't have paradox, that you can't have that grandfather paradox structure where you somehow prevent the event in the future that caused the event in the past. That, in fact, never works. And when physicists, a couple of students of Kip Thorne, the black hole and wormhole expert at Caltech, they actually worked this out in the 1980s. They sort of did the math and figured out that no, in fact, a billiard ball that their model was using billiard balls traveling through a wormhole into the past. The billiard ball would never nudge its earlier self away from the mouth of the wormhole. It would always nudge itself into the wormhole. So you wind up with this causally circular structure rather than with any kind of paradox. And there's a whole literature, and there's even experiments where retrocausation experiments where you try to the term is bilking in physics, where you try to prevent a prior event that would, and of course it doesn't work. I mean, you just can't have paradox is by definition impossible, and it winds up being impossible in the world as we live in it. So yes, there's an important distinction to be made here between paradox and tautology, and so we live, I believe, in a world of tautology.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you brought up the example of Jung, because one of the many sort of hidden pleasures of your book, meaning that you didn't necessarily expect it based on the title and even the subtitle, is the way in which you dive into and revise in very rich ways the whole tradition of psychoanalysis, not just with Jung and his archetypal ideas and his notions of synchronicity, but also Freud and the idea of the dream work and how we can look at dreams as relating. How do we understand the ambiguous language of dreams? Their sort of sense of provocative suggestion, but also weirdness, and then how we can deal with the traumatic aspects that are of the unconscious, of psychological experience, and all of that stuff was really wonderfully done. And I thought one place of kind of starting to talk about it is just to think a little bit more about dreams. And again, Freud's great discovery of the dream work, of the sense that there's some kind of something being hidden or something woven or a kind of symbolic language that's distorted and condensed and surreal, but that there's some kind of meaning there. It's not just noise, and it's worth unpacking. It's worth free associating, because those associations themselves have to do with the meanings that are encoded, if that's the right word, in any particular kind of dream experience. And then you take that sort of Freudian model and you take it in a really unexpected direction by including the possibility that what we mean by the unconscious is in many ways understandable as that capacity of our minds or brains to anticipate the future in certain ways, that's part of the weirdness of the unconscious is precisely that's where we've located these kinds of capacities. So, in a way, like, I'd just like to hear you unpack that a little bit and particularly talk about how the contemporary understanding of memory helps us understand what's going on in the dream world and also gives us a way of understanding how precognition operates as you describe it in terms of dreams.
Yeah, Freud, right? The basic argument I'm making, I think, in the second half of the book is that what we've been calling the unconscious, and what Freud called the unconscious. I don't know if he was the first to use. He really wasn't the first to use that term, but what we call the unconscious is really consciousness displaced in time, and and by consciousness I mean, let's say, cognition. I'm not trying to make a broad, some big claim about what consciousness is, but let's use the term consciousness in kind of the more reduced fashion that psychologists might be comfortable using the term. That it's really all these phenomena, dreams, slips of the tongue, all the other phenomena that Freud kind of examined, neurotic symptoms and so forth, may reflect our being influenced by our own future experiences, by traumas and other experiences, upheavals in our own future, and that they've been redefined. The psychoanalytic tradition, the psychological tradition, more generally, has always pointed our attention to the past, directed our attention to the past, and so Freud's very, very brilliantly and cleverly made everything that happens in our life, all the unconscious, all the manifestations of the unconscious in our lives, made it all about our childhood and our past and how we've failed to deal with something in our past. And it's a very brilliant story, and it's one has been very compelling for over a century now in our culture. But there's, Freud's been quote unquote debunked by many angry people from various angles in our culture over the years, and they've pointed to very real problems with his ideas, and yet they've never been able to quite unsettle sort of his basic core insights that seem to remain very, very powerful. And what I want to suggest is, hey, let's look at this in a new way. Let's think about how what has been called the unconscious maybe the problem might be looking to the past, when in fact memory, our understanding of memory from a lot of psychological research over the past century, shows that memory, we don't preserve events of our past, certainly not our early childhood, in any kind of pristine way, which was kind of a central assumption for Freud, that we did do that. But in fact, we don't. Memory is this constantly morphing, flowing construct. It's a construct about the past. It's not some pristine representation of the past. Well, maybe we need to really look to the future and the influence of future events as a part of the puzzle, or maybe even the whole puzzle. One of the brilliant the study of dreams has kind of been at an impasse for a long time. This is something I go into in one of the chapters in my book, because on the one hand you have the Freudians who say that, well, it's all meaningful and it all is repressed wishes, and then on the other hand you have neuroscientists saying no, it's meaningless, it's just brain processes, blah blah blah. And there doesn't seem to be any kind of meeting ground between these two perspectives. Well, a few years ago, a psychologist in Manchester named Sue Llewellyn pointed out very brilliantly, I think, that dreams are very much like the art of memory. If you're familiar with the art of memory, this was a technique used by orators in the ancient world, and in fact, it's used by people in non-literate societies everywhere, and in fact, it's used by all of us, even though we're not aware of it. Which is, you make associations, sort of very personal associations to new knowledge, new information, and those personal associations become sort of the threads that connect that new information to older experiences in your memory. And it's the way you find information in your head. When you're searching for information, you're following very personal trains of association. Well, not only does it brilliantly link up what we know about the neurobiology of memory with the humanities, with this ancient tradition from the humanities, but it also really kind of rehabilitates the Freudian view, which was based on free association, this idea of taking a dream element and just thinking, well, what's the first thing that reminds me of? And that's the way you arrive at the so-called meaning in a dream. Well, what I'm suggesting in this book is that dreams are essentially an art of memory style bundle of associations to future events. And certainly my own experience interpreting my own dreams from the standpoint of precognition has supported that very strongly. And looking at precognitive dreams in the published literature, it also kind of supports that idea. And it's sort of an idea I don't think there's any possibility of ever proving this, but I think it offers at least a very interesting new framing or a new kind of lens onto the study of dreams and dream work.
One interesting thing about this idea about memory, our more contemporary ideas about memory, is something that we're constantly refabricating. We're taking chunks and reorganizing them. That it's a moving target. Is that it undermines one of the kind of common refrains that you hear from skeptics when there's some kind of extraordinary knowledge that seems to be appearing in either a dream or some kind of seemingly paranormal event where they're like, oh, it's cryptomnesia. They've been exposed to the information 43 years ago when they read this one encyclopedia. Now it's returned, in a disguised form. And, I'm sure that something like that happens sometimes. But again, when you get these sort of repetitive invocations of abstract psychological conditions, one should grow a bit skeptical of the skeptics. And that's an example of one, because it becomes harder to explain the return of ancient information as if you acknowledge that our memories are constantly changing and that they're not just, written in stone.
Absolutely. And there's so many, there's so many examples of this. One of the ones I give in the book is of Sir Alec Guinness, the actor, of course, who played Obi-Wan Kenobi, as we all know. He had this experience around a painting in his house. I won't tell the whole story, but something was bothering him about this painting, and this voice in his head was announcing this Bible passage, chapter and verse Bible passage. And he had studied he had gone to religious school in his teens, but he had long since, he had no interest in religion or the Bible or anything like that. This was I think he was in his 20s or 30s at this point. But he went and he scrounged up a Bible somewhere and found this passage that was going in his head, and it described perfectly, uncannily, something that he had not noticed in this painting before. And so you could naturally, the skeptic's response is going to naturally be, oh, cryptomnesia. But what I want to suggest is that if precognition is really as universal a phenomenon as I suggested it would have to be. If it exists at all, it's got to be universal, and it can't be just this kind of rare, one-off kind of experience. Then his cognition, his brain was orienting him to this learning experience that was, I use the term latent in the sort of landscape of his life, that he was about to discover through a self-fulfilling prophecy, again, by finding that Bible, opening up, looking at the passage. So it's sort of a kind of time loop structure. But I think that it really makes so much of psychology so much more parsimonious to think about so much of what we think of as somehow extraordinary feats of memory as really just being extraordinary, not extraordinary, but very mundane feats of precognition. That is, being oriented towards information we're about to be exposed to, things we're about to learn. And so, on the one hand, it seems like a skeptic is just going to go, what? They're not going to be able to accept that at all. But once you sort of wrap your head around the idea of retrocausation and precognition and sort of accept it, you realize that it kind of could simplify a lot of things in psychology, really. Not just things like dreams and synchronicities, but it could really make a new kind of sense. There's a tendency in current psychology to want to flatten the mind. In fact, there's a new book by Nick Chater called "The Mind Is Flat," and the argument is, there is no buried unconscious. There's no unconscious operating behind the scenes. It's all very much a flat kind of phenomenon. Well, this would enable the mind to be flat in this kind of satisfying way. If what we've been burying in this kind of illusory unconscious is in fact our cognition spread out in time ahead of us as well as behind us.
Well,
okay, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, for me, that's another example of one of the intriguing aspects of your book is that once you grant the impossible premise, that such a thing is possible, it not only solves a lot of problems in this parsimonious way, but it actually supports a non-mysterious universe. Like, it's once you accept this mystery or this seeming impossibility of precognition, it actually supports not a supernatural view, not a prophetic view, not an oracular view, not a mystical view, so much as one that's just grounded in biology, and in fact makes these other stories seem more arcane and esoteric than they.
What's funny about the reaction I've gotten to this book and to my blog is that people find it actually kind of disappointingly materialist. I don't consider myself a real materialist exactly, but people who are interested in the paranormal and supernatural and so forth find this argument to kind of threaten, I think, this maybe some of their cherished paranormal or supernatural beliefs, because it's kind of it actually kind of reconciles in some way things that appear supernatural or paranormal with a kind of maybe not materialist, but actually that the term you suggested once when we were talking, the term naturalist view of the world. That this is now, we're not talking about some process that is over and above natural processes. That we're talking about something that's really embedded in the fabric of biology and physics, and it's just been resolutely overlooked by the Enlightenment tradition.
Yeah, it's a strange place to be. I mean, this is kind of what I call weird naturalism. Is that you're really stuck in between, because you're going to piss off, like the hardcore skeptics or rationalists aren't even going to pay attention to you. They're going to take one whiff of what you're doing and be like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
And then you're left with people who are interested, and a very large percentage of them, we're not a huge, there's plenty of us in kind of in the middle, if you will, but there's a large percentage of people who are there precisely because they want some kind of religion, or they want some kind of sense that there's another world, that the mysteries are true, that the stories they knew when they were kids are true, or that there's some compensation for the banality and flatness of the kind of modern worldview. And I think these things do provide not just compensation, but insights and opportunities for having a broader, more multidimensional view of the world. But in my personal, kind of aesthetic or ethics, I'm not really sure which, that to get the goods, you have to pay for it with naturalism. Like panpsychism, I'm very attracted to. I'm very attracted to the idea that there's some kind of mindedness, some kind of responsive intelligence in everything, subatomic particles, rocks, everything. But in a way, I only allow myself that thought by paying for it with the observation that could be seen as just simply another aspect of the unit. You got energy, matter, and consciousness. It's no big deal. Consciousness there's nothing special about it at all. Maybe ours is a little bit more advanced. Okay, it's cool. Maybe we do time binding things that other kinds of consciousness can't do. But that banality is actually part of the intrigue. I mean, in your Phil Dick section, and I want to turn to Dick in just a moment. You have a great phrase where you say one of the marvelous things about Phil Dick and the exegesis is the way that it demonstrates the banality of spirituality. And it's kind of an ironic term, but in a way it's also, there's something about that I think really reflects where we are. And the way in which your theory, even as you dive into these really crazy possibilities, that you're constantly refusing the temptation to provide exotic enchantment to the reader. Instead, you're going, well, actually, it's just something we do, guys. Anyway, I really admire. I really admire that.
I love it. I'm like you're really trying to disenchant my. I see what you mean by that. That's really funny.
So anyway, so before we get to PKD, we got about 20 minutes here. So I just want to just do an acknowledgement that an important part of this story, particularly from a psychoanalytic perspective, is that we're not just precognizing anything. We're precognizing future learning experiences for future events that are emotionally powerful and generally, as far as your anecdotes go, traumatic. They're about death, disaster, plane crashes, disappointments. So there's an aspect of your story that really has to do with trauma and our attraction to it.
Yeah, understood very broadly. And I'm using the term trauma kind of more in a psychoanalytic sense, that trauma is something that kind of upsets our expectations of the world. Now that can be something big, like a disaster or a loss, a death, illness, something like that. And certainly those kinds of events seem, if you study the literature of precognition, there's disproportionately somehow the stories that come to us seem to be about those things. But when you sort of delve into it, and certainly delve into your own dreams and so forth, you realize that, well, trauma has a much broader meaning, and it can it can be really anything that kind of reframes or reorients your perception, just because it challenges you, something that winds up giving you a broader perspective, perhaps at the cost of some of your dignity, maybe, the sink backing up or falling down a flight of steps or something like that, those kinds of events or learning experiences that just kind of provoke a sort of challenging or disturbing train of thought can also, be traumatic in that sense. So yeah, I want to be clear that when we talk about trauma, we're not necessarily talking about trauma in the vernacular sense of like something really, truly awful. I mean, it can often be just kind of unsettling to our, I don't know, our sense of self.
Sure. It's just that a lot of the classic examples seem to be of, very, very strong events for, I can't remember her name right now, but the woman, the Houston woman that Jeff Kripal talks about, and I think his forthcoming book. So like she got hit by lightning, and then she started to record her own, premonitions essentially, and she would write emails to herself, so they would be time stamped, and they and many of them seem some sort of uncannily predictive of a lot of them were airline crashes. So there was some sort of relationship with that kind of like, and I guess what partly the reason I ask about it is that we're in this interesting place because we're so inundated with news and information all day long. We kind of slightly traumatize ourselves with the latest slice of horror. And so it seems to me there's some connection, if you will, or there's some dimension of what we're doing to ourselves with our constant exposure to the ongoing crisis on so many different levels in our world right now. That kind of involves this strange attraction to trauma, need to control it, but also the desire to return to it. And whether or not that has to do with precognition, it does seem to be a very, basic thing that's happening now. This kind of relationship to trauma that you talk about to some extent.
That's why the notion, I use this it's kind of a pretentious French term, jouissance. You're only forced to use it because there isn't really a good translation in English, but it's this kind of notion of enjoyment that's kind of repellent, enjoyment. And this is why I even though he's become the sort of bloated Jabba the Hutt of philosophy, I really kind of love Slavoj Žižek because he sort of made jouissance the sort of core of his cultural theory and our engagement with the media and with politics and so forth. This kind of study of this repellent enjoyment that flows through our social life right now in this hyper-mediated era. And so he's always been sort of a philosophical touchstone for me. And that notion of jouissance really, I think, is it's sort of the signal line of precognition. That kind of future jouissance, sort of refluxing back or resonating back along your world line. So these future these future events where we're kind of both attracted and repelled by some piece of information. And disasters are a perfect example. 9/11. It's like, okay, on the one hand, you could describe it as a trauma, but it was a trauma in a very specific psychoanalytic sense that we were all riveted to our TVs. We were enjoying this in this horrible vampiric kind of way, and you have to kind of make a place for that in your understanding of these events and how they impact us. And it's precisely those kind of conflicted, contradictory, paradoxical emotions that I think precognition focuses on in the future. And like even going back to just an innocent example like the beetle, arriving at Jung's window. Well, that moment, it did, Jung was right. It did, well, I'm assuming he was honest there, that, it sort of expanded her. It opened her to something, and it was something she wanted, that kind of opened perspective on her life. And that too is a kind of trauma in the sense that it's destroying a previous self-conception and replacing it with something newer and broader. And of course, Jung called it individuation. But, that too is a kind of survival of a kind of destruction. And so it's sort of that same jouissance logic, can explain even something as innocent seeming as a dream about someone handing you a piece of scarab jewelry.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I think part of the reason I'm pushing the questions in this direction is leading into talking about Phil Dick, because one of the interesting things about Dick is that if you're really going into the whole shebang, you all of the cool stuff, the brilliant novels, the strange prophecies, the exoticism of his own experiences, his kind of mystical insights, his strange paranormal experiences, that all of that is happening in the context of sometimes immense psychological suffering. Like, the dude was he was a hurting pup. And the relationship of that, whether you're a fan or a scholar or whatever, but that relationship is really a key element. And it seems to me that traumatic trace, if that traumatic trace is part of the signature of precognition, it would make sense that this most precog of sci-fi writers, if not of writers in general, is such a deeply, traumatized person, like someone who had so much psychological and personal suffering. And yet, out of that, he made amazing art. And as I applauded when I read in your book, as you described, the Exegesis is definitely one of the most important spiritual works in the 20th century, which I very much believe. Now, people have. What do you think when we're looking at the situation of PKD? What do you think is most important to keep in mind in terms of discussing these precognitive elements in his stories that seem to predict future events? Then you can even sort of see them through time, or indeed his own descriptions of his prophetic dreams, and there's so much material in his vast corpus. How would you help guide someone through that? Because it can be very overwhelming and very strange if you're really interested in finding traces of these precognitive events.
Yeah, well, there's so many traces, and honestly, I'm just the latest in a pretty long line of people writing about these phenomena in Phil Dick's life. And in fact, there are only 2 chapters in this book that really scared me to publish, because I was just afraid of what people who know so much better about the topic were going to come back and say. And that's one of them is the Phil Dick chapter. The other one's the quantum physics chapter, because I'm not a quantum physicist. But the Phil Dick stuff, it's like, you're a much bigger expert on Phil Dick than I am. And so many people have written about these experiences. But the one thing that I think the contribution I kind of wanted to make, in addition to sort of highlighting a few precognitive experiences, a couple of which have been written about before, and a couple of which I think that I'm the first to my knowledge, to point out. But there's so many. I mean, you just go to his letters and you start seeing these things. Not to mention his fiction. But I guess the perspective that I am into it, that might be original, I hope, is the notion that maybe these precognitive experiences were satisfying a need in him, and that need was not to see the world as these, constantly shifting realities and all that stuff that we sort of associate with Phil Dick. But the need was exactly the opposite, to see this block universe underlying it all. And that in that block universe, it's not little Phil Dick's fault that his twin sister died, in infancy, and not his fault that he got addicted to amphetamines, and not his fault, that he had all these failed marriages, and that, his life was full of all this suffering and kind of failure. That precognition kind of satisfies a certain need for absolution in the block universe. And it was actually in studying this other science fiction writer from a century ago, the one who predicted the Titanic, Morgan Robertson, that that kind of gave me this altered, I guess, perspective on Phil Dick, because this psychoanalyst, Jewel Eisenbud, a psychoanalyst and parapsychologist, wrote this very brilliant sort of interpretation of Morgan Robertson. Sort of he was, again, a very neurotic science fiction writer, had an addiction, in that case to alcohol, and his life was full of these synchronicities and precognitive experiences. Then he winds up writing a story about an ocean liner called the Titan that's struck by an iceberg, and this is 14 years before the Titanic sinks and so forth. Well, and there's so many parallels between Morgan Robertson and Phil Dick, including the age at which they died. Sort of just a lot of weird parallels. And Jewel Eisenbud's sort of diagnosis of Morgan Robertson was that his precognition kind of satisfied this need to absolve himself, to be absolved of these shameful things in his life, such as his addiction. Because that's what, a good precognitive experience provides, this sense of it's all inevitable. The future already exists. So there's nothing I could have done differently. And then that may seem like, well, that just absolves us of responsibility, blah, blah, blah. Well, look at it from the opposite point of view. We're all neurotic. We're all failures in some way. Maybe it's worth kind of sitting with this idea of predestination, if you want to put it that way, or the block universe.
I just to interrupt. I think that you're that as a reading of Phil Dick's Need, it is a real contribution. It really helped me see some of the ways in which he flirts with the deterministic model in the exegesis, even though he also resists it in a lot of ways. Yeah. And what it ties into, in a way, is a part of our earlier. I mean, this might be a little bit way out of a thought, but that our earlier conversations about jouissance, this idea of like a pleasure that's also kind of repulsive, is that there's something in that determinism that is like that. Because inside determinism, there's this great relief. It's great relief in a way, but the relief is coupled with this very sober, sometimes sort of grim accounting of all of these places where we put our hope and our ability to change and to make decisions and to grow and and those things might still happen, but you really got to let a lot of stuff go to really embrace that universe. So it itself is a kind of space of jouissance, and I think you can see that in Dick's relationship to the metaphysics too.
Yeah, totally.
What do you like? How do you deal with the fact that, as you write about, that our world itself seems to be becoming more Phil Dickian, in a way that's not particularly pleasant for us? Sometimes it almost feels like we shouldn't be reading him as much, or you shouldn't be leaking into Hollywood as much, because we're getting into a self-fulfilling prophecy that kind of bastard trickster set us up for. But there is an additional kind of looping quality to just the way people respond to him or dream about him, or you yourself end the book with a prophetic dream from many years ago in your life, and some of the elements of that dream are clearly tied to the stuff you only discover much later about Phil Dick. There's something particularly enigmatic about his work that way, where you feel like you're entering into some kind of looping game that is both fascinating and a little menacing.
Well, this is kind of where I'm going in the next book. The sequel to Time Loops will be sort of about this relation to culture, this kind of precognitive relation to culture, and the way certain texts act as, the term in chaos theory is strange attractors. They act as attractors that sort of draw us toward them, and then we wind up precognizing them before we read them. And I think Dick's work, not only his writings, but just his life, kind of learning about his life, and maybe I honestly think it has something to do with his name, and I talk about in the book, and we don't need to talk about it here, but there are aspects of Dick that that act as some sort of associative attractor in the mind of future readers, people who haven't read him yet. And it was certainly in the case of, for me, I don't, in the book, I don't really talk about my own precognitive dreams except for one at the end where and it's certainly centered partly on Phil Dix and his life, and that I didn't yet know about at the time of the dream. But I think that there are other figures that exert a similar power, and I suspect that the great writers of religious texts throughout history, I suspect that those texts or themselves have had that same quality, that somehow it unsettles us in precisely the right way, that we wind up coming to those texts having precognized them. And as a result, they have an uncanny power over us because, oh my God, there's something familiar here. And there's one of my favorite pieces of writing, probably most influential piece of writing for me is what Ralph Waldo Emerson's Self-Reliance. And he has a great line in there about how we come to texts that he's sort of making an argument for why we need to express ourselves and have courage to express ourselves, because if we don't, we will read our own ideas in someone else's work. And those texts will then have what he calls an alienated majesty about them. Well, I think that there's a way in which maybe all of our original ideas really flow from our future, flow from things we will read in our future. And that experience of alienated majesty, of finding ourselves described in a text, is really a reflection, one of these reflections of precognition, and that it's really kind of the motor of creativity, or it is creativity, that kind of reading into our future, or drawing from our future, and then finding it confirmed somehow. And artists are those who are able to kind of create from this uncertain state of precognition, and then find them what they've written confirmed in either other things that they read or in their own lives or whatever. And there are just innumerable cases of this. I had to cut like tons of chapters from the book because it was just getting too long.
Well, but I look forward to your further studies, and I would have to congratulate you by saying that I believe you may have written one of those enigmatic texts that certain readers will find sort of chillingly on point, disturbingly familiar, as if they've read it before, perhaps in some looping universe that even now we're participating in. However, the time clock of linear causality is still ringing, so we're going to have to wind it up here. Eric Wargo, thanks you so much for our two episode run here on Expanding Mind.
Oh, this has been a wonderful, really fun conversation. Thank you, Eric.
Great. Once again, Eric's the author of Time Loops, Precognition, Retrocausation, and the Unconscious, and he blogs at The Nightshirt. I highly recommend checking out that blog. It's constantly interesting. So until next week, keep your minds open.